Right, hello everyone, welcome. I want to do a little bit of a different video and I want to talk about AI decks for a second. So this is a deck that is an AI deck, okay? You've seen me use this deck in readings. I actually do really like this deck, okay? This is, what is this deck called even? Oh, shoot, sorry. I can't even remember what this deck's called. I'll put the name of this deck in the description box below. This deck is an AI deck, okay? There's certain aspects of it that are really obvious that it's an AI deck. The artwork is not, doesn't really match up. And actually, I believe I did an unboxing. I might have done an unboxing of this. I'm not sure if that file got corrupted or not. Well, I might have done an unboxing of this deck, and I believe talked about that, about how this deck, there's a lot of cards in this deck that, like the Seven of Swords card, that the imagery in the card doesn't match really with the traditional meaning, right? The world, this is not a regular depiction of the world, okay? And the same goes for the book. I don't know where I actually put the book because I don't use the guidebook for these things. This is an added card, by the way. The Celestial Weaver is not a card within tarot. Okay, but like this is the Two of Pentacles. This doesn't really depict anything that like the Two of Pentacles talks about. And if I use this deck, you'll notice that I tend to read the imagery. I'll say sometimes what the card says it is, but usually I'm reading the imagery, and I do like the imagery, and that's why I use this deck. However, I want to talk about AI decks for a second because I don't think that all AI decks are equal. And I don't think that all AI decks should be used, right? I do think that there are some AI decks that you can work around. This is one of those where I can work around this deck, okay? However, I do want to say this is AI is not a positive thing. On a spiritual level, AI is not a positive thing. So this deck, I probably clear this deck more than any other deck I own. I constantly am being mindful of the energy of this deck because typically when a deck is created, you have a certain amount of energy of the artist and the creator that goes into the deck. All right, so if I were to take this deck here, this is one of my favorite decks. This is the Everyday Witch tarot deck. I've used this deck for like since it came out, basically. Absolutely love this deck. There's a certain level of energy that you can get from this deck, especially when you first get the deck, that comes from the creator of this deck, Deborah something. I can't remember her name. Okay, that comes from the creator of the deck. The problem with AI is that AI is not inherently, on a spiritual sense, it's not inherently good. So when you have decks like this, you have to be a little bit more mindful of the messaging that's coming through them to make sure that you're using them properly, right? There are some readers who are 100% against AI decks, and I understand why. Because when you're dealing with something that is technological, that doesn't have a spiritual sense, it's really difficult to connect and say, okay, well, there's no spiritual, there's no energy literally that's in this. This is what I would call almost a dead deck because there is very little energy that's in it. The energy that's here is energy from the people that have handled the deck. Okay, so the delivery agent, for example, the postal office, the postal workers, and myself, obviously, having used it. When I first got the deck, that's the energy that was on it. Otherwise, this is what would be known as a dead deck, right? It's a deck that has no intention behind it because it's AI, and AI cannot have intention. Artificial intelligence cannot have intention behind what they do. And that's obvious when you see so many of these pictures that don't align with the card itself, right? You don't see wands. This is Queen of Wands. You don't see for the suit, right? King of Pentacles. There's no pentacles. There's no wands. Very rarely are there cups, right? This is Two of Cups. There's no cups. There's two people, but there's no cups that are to be had within this card, right? High Priestess, right? You're not getting unlocked King of Swords. There's no swords, right? And that's because that, again, it didn't, AI can't actually, AI just can't connect to what these cards, the spiritual level, are supposed to mean, right? They can't do that. And so when I use this deck, you'll notice that I use it a little bit more like an oracle deck. I focus more on the imagery instead of focusing on what the card traditionally would represent, because this deck is AI driven. And then I clear this deck far more frequently than I would clear any other deck, right? So let's talk about some cautions you should have with AI deck. And I've kind of been going over this myself. If you're a beginner, I would not recommend you do an AI deck, okay? Because you're not going to get the imagery that you need. You're not going to understand when you pick up other decks, you're not going to understand the imagery that's in those decks because you haven't worked with a deck that has the imagery you need. So I'd be very mindful of, if you're a complete beginner and you're learning tarot, don't pick up an AI deck. Be really mindful. I always recommend the Rider-Waite deck, which I might have here. Okay. My version is a Spanish version, but this is the traditional Rider-Waite tarot. Okay, this is the deck that I recommend and that most readers will recommend when you are learning tarot. And the reason we recommend this deck is because this deck's imagery traditionally, when you have another deck that comes about, that another artist renders, that's not AI, right? Traditionally, they are basing the imagery on the imagery that is of this deck, the Rider-Waite tarot deck. It's actually properly called the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, right? And maybe one day I'll do a whole thing about how Pamela Coleman-Smith, who is the artist of this deck, kind of gets forgotten, but that's a whole other story. But this is the deck that most readers will tell you that it's recommended you use to learn on. And then when you pick up another deck, okay, and I'm going to use again my favorite deck here. This is the Everyday Witch Tarot. When you pick up a deck like this, now you're able to understand, even though the images are slightly different, you're able to see similarities between the images that are present in the theme and what it's supposed to mean, because it's still based loosely off of this deck when you start having, right? So, you know, this is Five of Cups, for example, right? You're going to notice the imagery is slightly different, but the Ten of Wands is always going to look slightly, there's always going to be similarities. It's always going to be someone having a pile of wands of some sort. In this case, it's brooms, right? Bosoms that are there. Okay, that doesn't get expressed in an AI deck. So if you're a complete beginner, I would never in a million years recommend you get an AI deck. In fact, if you're not someone who is well versed in tarot, right, I would say even most intermediary people, I would not recommend an AI deck. And the reason is because AI, and again, I do want to say this is my belief, and I might get demonized for this belief, but AI, in terms of spirituality, is something that needs to be treaded with caution. It's something that we need to be mindful of. It's something we need to be aware of. It's something we need to just tread with a little bit of caution. And that includes the tools we use. Okay, I did not just pull this deck out of a box and start doing a reading with it. This deck required a little bit of extra work into it in order for you to actually properly, safely utilize it. Okay. I'm not going to say that the deck is necessarily dangerous. I'm going to say, though, that it's just not... I like the deck because of the imagery. I like the deck because of its use as an oracle deck for the style that I read. The style that I read is not a traditional style. I don't see many readers read tarot or oracle the way that I read it. Okay. And I don't expect other people to read the way I read. And every single person who picks up a deck is going to read it slightly differently. And that's what makes so many readers on YouTube so successful, is because they do take the same card, right? And they can read it so many different ways. But would I say that this is a correct depiction of King of Cups? Absolutely not. So I'm either going to read this card as King of Cups, or I'm going to read this card based on the imagery here. Typically, I've been using this deck, and I believe I've been mostly using it. I think there's maybe one reading I did. I didn't do this, but I've been mostly reading this as as the imagery, not as the actual tarot cards, right? Four of Wands, there's not a wand to be found, and there's a house, which is really interesting. When I first looked at the deck, what I found really interesting about this particular AI version of the deck compared to other AI decks that I have purchased and returned, which is most of them. This is actually the only one that I have kept. I actually have one Oracle deck that I kept, only because I forgot to return it and I missed the return window. But I don't use that deck. You haven't seen that deck. It's not even, it's tucked away in my closet. It's not even out. I don't utilize that deck because most AI decks are utter failures. And this one, to an extent, I would also say is a failure. But what I like about this deck is that some of the cards, even though, for example, the Four of Wands does not depict wands, it does talk about foundations and homes, which is part of the message of the Four of Wands. So it's not completely lost, but it's not traditional either. Does that make sense? I don't think that a reader is necessarily fake or bad if they use an AI deck. However, I have noticed that a lot of readers, when they use AI decks, they tend to repeat the same message over and over and over and over again. I'm not sure if they realize that. I think that's because you're dealing with a deck that doesn't have a base energy to it. You're dealing with a deck that has been made with no meaning and no intention behind it at the end of the day. Okay. We are relying, for example, this deck, I am relying on the editors of the deck for their intention and for their understanding and for their meaning. But there is no author of the deck because it's AI. Okay. AI decks, I would say, is a really great area. I would say it's an area that I do express caution in. It's an area that I do think more people need to express caution in. And especially, and I cannot stress this enough, if you are a beginner, do not get an AI deck. Okay, if you are a beginner, you need to learn how to properly read and understand and feel the energy and connect to the energy before you try to delve into the world of deciphering if an AI deck is appropriate, which ones are good for you, which ones are not good for you, things of that nature, right? For the most part, I'm not for AI decks. I'm going to say that. Personally, for the most part, I will not support AI decks. It's a very, very rare occasion. And I think it takes away from a lot of the beautiful art that is in tarot and oracle if we start relying and supporting these AI companies. So I really try not to. This was ultimately a mistake purchase that I made that I turned into something beneficial. But I'm also now far more mindful of the decks that I purchase and what it is that I'm putting my money, which is also energy, remember that, and my energy into, so that it can't be harvested and used later for nefarious reasons. they may potentially come about. I'm going to leave that there. I know it was a bit of a ramble. I know it didn't probably really make sense. I'm just going to go with it. And next one will be a reading, I promise. Bye.